and this is an item that has several components to it. And the first one is, and it relates to COVID-19 Recovery Act funding. The first one has to do with the cybersecurity funding that has been received. And the intent in the work here is to try to provide education to our districts and users of our devices throughout the state. Second, to provide a study with respect to our cybersecurity structure and system for the 115 LEAs. And the third thing is to be able to distribute some money to on an ADM basis to LEAs around the state, because there are things that they could benefit from having assistance in purchasing as part of the support for their cybersecurity systems. Staff has spent a lot of time on this item. There's been some difficulties in terms of trying to get all the funding in place. This is very helpful funding, but not necessarily all the funding, but I think a lot of good thought is going into it, and I think we have a proposal for the board today on this particular item that will be helpful, very helpful, in fact, to better providing cybersecurity protections. I think Michael Nicolodes is with us to describe the plan. And Michael, are you here?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. So we have received $4.5 million for cybersecurity. So with the way we propose to distribute the money, they use $547,000. That will be to extend the current cybersecurity training that we have for all state employees, and extend this training to all PSU employees. There's 185,000 approximately employees at our public school units, and this will provide them with the same training for 2 years. And that's about 6 sessions per calendar year. And with one-time funds, we can provide this training for 2 years in hopes that we would receive funding in the future to extend this contract in perpetuity. This will be an amendment to an existing DIT contract. I would also like to add that this same training is also being extended to the community colleges staff, and the community colleges did exactly the same thing. They are amending the DIT contract to extend this to all the 58 community colleges staff. The second part we are proposing, which I believe it will be one of the most critical things to do in our efforts to mitigate cybersecurity risks across our public school units, is to perform on-site assessments at each district. Basically, we work with MCNC. We will extend the existing services contract we have with MCNC, and MCNC will send teams to each PSU to perform a local on-site assessment of their current systems, of the, this includes both servers and user units. They will look at their websites. They will look at their, basically the total IT infrastructure at these units, look at their network, and come up with recommendations of things that they will need to do in order to close potential security holes or risks. $500,000 will only cover assessments at 50 PSUs. However, there is funding in the existing contract which will allow us to perform assessments at all of our public school units. So the assessments will begin around now, actually September, and 50 will be done by December 31st using COVID funding. Then we will continue these assessments into January all the way to March to complete the assessments for all units using funding from the existing contract. So this $500,000 is supplementing an existing contract in order to be able to do those assessments. We will also use the existing contract after the assessments to do the remediation efforts. Again, with MCNC, we'll work with our schools in order to, once they find the problems that need to be resolved, work with them to resolve those issues. The third item is the remaining funds, which is we're proposing to allot the funds to the PSUs using the 50% ADN, 50% economic status formula with a minimum amount to each unit of $2,000. We set the minimum in order to have a meaningful allocation to these districts. These funds can be used by the districts in various cybersecurity things that they have, that they need. There is what we found out from our recent survey is that there are different needs at different school districts. They have needs for backups, backups in the cloud, so they have secure backups. They have needs for endpoint protection, or maybe email programs that are anti-phishing applications that you install on your email servers to try to cut those things, or antivirus. And there is an allotment policy attached to this item that lists all the different items to which the public school units can spend this funding. There is also a situation where, because of the loss of the technology funding, for our school districts, some of the districts have expressed the need. They said, we were using this funding to pay for our antivirus, and they need replacement funding, so they can even use it to replace part of the technology fund that they lost. And I will stop here and be able to answer any questions you may have.
All right, are there questions with respect to this, what I'm going to call three-pronged approach, and I believe an efficient use of limited resources to help secure this important issue? Are there some any questions or comments about this item? Yes, Mr. Buxton.
If I just can't recall exactly the proposal, but I remember when we had our report presented to us, I want to say late 2019, early 2020, there was a cybersecurity approach for the use of the money that feels like it's a little different. I don't remember it having the allotment to the units. And so just wondering what's changed between now and then to build the allotments in. The unit allotments versus the
Right.
enterprise-wide, statewide approaches.
Mr. Nicolaides, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, the report was issued in January based on what we knew back in November, December. And there was a plan to build a statewide infrastructure to be able to protect our schools. What has happened between November and now, what has changed, basically, we saw, first of all, this money is not enough to do what we said in our report. And we couldn't build half of an infrastructure. It's not adequate to do a statewide program. In addition, after we did the survey with our public school units, after we received the COVID funding, we realized the actual on-the-ground needs are much more dire at the districts for cybersecurity things, even basic things like antivirus and things that they should be having. There are issues for things like that. So we believe this is a one-time money. It needs to be expended by December. So we think this is the best approach, is to give the money to the district so they can fill those immediate needs. And we're still lobbying in order to secure additional cybersecurity money that is recurring, that we can build this statewide infrastructure and we can do a more of a statewide approach. The biggest thing we need to do now also, I have to repeat it, is those assessments at the school districts. Unfortunately, because of this money, it has to be spent by December. The maximum number of units we can assess between now and December are 50 school units. And most of these are large LEAs. That's where we start.
So if I could supplement that answer slightly, and then thank you for that very fine response. We are still on the same path. We've gone to the most urgent needs here. The first one is operator education. That's always has been part of the plan and was part of that plan. The second one is security assessments, and what we've been able to do with the funds that we've got here is to redirect some additional funds in addition to these funds and cover the security assessments for all of the LEAs. And then we also, the local districts, in terms of their allocations, they have kinds of issues that were described by Mr. Nicolaides that came out of the surveys that were done after the report, and this will allow them to work on and resolve those more localized issues. So we have a statewide structure, and that's what the vulnerability assessment's for, and there will be additional monies available to address those vulnerabilities. In terms of the different statewide structure, the longer term one that Mr. Nicolaides is talking about, I would remind the board, we still have a $5 million budget request out to the legislature for that. And so I do want to remind everyone, we're still pursuing that in a meaningful way, and we'll continue to do so.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it, Ms. Duncan.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you for that question. All right.
Mr. Duncan, this is Olivia.
Yes.
I just have a question, and I think my question is one that is just for pure educating Olivia on cybersecurity. And it has to do with, would a statewide system, when I think of statewide, I think of more than the Department of Public Instruction. I think of all of the agencies and departments, or am I incorrect in that assumption? The other part of that is, well, let me just pose that one question to Michael.
Mr. Nicolaides?
Yeah, statewide system, actually we refer only to our public schools. The DPI proper, as we call it, is covered by cybersecurity funding that is allocated through DIT, who has the responsibility of covering state agencies. So we have been receiving additional services from DIT for our own infrastructure. For example, I mentioned a new program that is called anti-phishing programs that you install on your email server that would detect phishing attempts. And we're implementing that one on our email server with the help of DIT. So when I mention statewide, I mean exclusively the school units, not DIT.
Okay, that does make the distinction. Thank you, Mr. Nicolaides, for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. All right, any additional questions or comments or thoughts on this item? All right, still on BizOp 2, another item is a proposed revision on our school nutrition allocations, and I think Alexis Schaus and Dr. Harvey are both available to discuss this item, which really focuses on a time extension for use of the funds for child nutrition through the end of the year.
Yes, so this is Alexis Schaus. So
Please.
there are two additional items under BSOP 2. One is just an amendment to the CRF school nutrition allotment policy that the board has already approved. However, there was an extension to the use of those funds by legislation. That is the item number one, extending the use to December 30th. And then the second item is a new policy for the coronavirus relief fund money associated with low wealth supplemental funding. And in the sessional 2020-4, it provided $22 million for low wealth counties, public schools that are located in a low wealth county. So it does include charter schools located in low wealth counties, for them to have funds out of the coronavirus relief fund to provide additional support related to COVID. And so that is what this policy is addressing. And I am happy to take any questions related to it.
you have any questions on these items, just covered as part of Biz Op 3.
Mr. Duncan,
Yes.
this is Tony Jackson. I would just want to clarify that these, Ms. Schaus, this is for PRC 134, so will the same chart of accounts for low wealth follow these, or will there be a different or new chart of accounts for these funds?
These funds do have the same use and chart of accounts as the low wealth supplemental funding.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you for asking that question, because I know that needed clarification, and I think Ms. Schaus has been working to clarify that with districts, but I appreciate your asking that, Dr. Jackson. Those would be our items. There's a couple other items in this area that I think we should go ahead and address while we're talking about these allotments. The first one is there's been some question that had arisen. I think the board has seen some emails that had arisen with respect to the EC funding that the board voted on the allotment of the 10%, actually the 9.5% set aside amount for the CARES Act funds. And just so it's clear and to clarify, I think we would ask the board to vote as needed. It's been suggested it would be helpful and appropriate to have an amendment to that particular application that went to the Department of Education to go ahead and have that clarification and amendment done and voted on by the board to reflect that what the funds are intended for, which is to assist the units around the state with the greatest needs in terms of EC future services needs, of which they're very substantial in the state, and our funding is not otherwise as adequate as it needs to be to do all the things that we need to do for these students based on the returns we've gotten from across the state, from all the counties with respect to their EC students. And that's really part of a larger effort that I think has been discussed within the department by leadership. And I think everyone will recall when we had that budget before us a meeting or two ago, there were, for each of the items, there was a division within DPI that was indicated would be the one that would have some oversight responsibility. It would fall within their general oversight. And so for purposes of monitoring these funds and assuring that everyone feels good about the maximization of their use, the suggestion has been made, I think coming from within the department and supported certainly by board leadership, that there be an effort to have each of the areas that is department leadership formulate what the proposed plan is. And I know that's already going on. Be able to report to the board what the proposed plan is, and then later come back and be able to report to the board what has been done objectively to benefit our students as a result of this funding and these allocations. And I think that's something that would cause everybody to feel good about what we're doing with the funds, and to make sure that we're monitoring and feel good about the effective use of the funds. Dr. Emery, you may want to address that. I think you've had some conversations involved with that type of organization. Would you care to address that approach?
Yes, sir, Mr. Duncan. Just a quick update that we have made sure all of the business owners participated in an informal orientation this week with Dr. Tricia Townsend, who helped us understand the federal requirements as well as us adding the board's goals and their intended outcomes, so that all of us are consistent in the way we plan and spend this money, but most importantly that we have performance outcomes tied to these investments and an ability to track them so we can demonstrate that we invested them wisely and that, more importantly, they had impact for our North Carolina children, school districts, schools, charters, that we do have an evidence-based investment here. I think we're well on our way. Good commitment from all business owners, and Dr. Townsend did a great job of preparing a folder with the requirements and templates for logic model, et cetera. And I think folks were appreciative that we work on this consistently.
Thank you. That work is clearly already underway, but we thought we would try to formalize it with the board and make sure that the board thought that was an appropriate and a good approach. I'm seeing nods of heads here, but I can't see everyone on the phone. So if anyone has a thought differently, please express it. All right, so I guess formally on Biz Op 3, I would add that when we vote on that we would also be voting to amend the application if it's deemed necessary to the Department of Education on the Exceptional Children Fund to focus on the services, the future services to the children, and to the extent a diagnostic tool was referred to in the application, that's not, after some review, that's not determined that that's something that's going to be pursued as part of it. So I would ask that to be part of Biz Op 3, Mr. Chair. Biz Op 4 is the North Carolina Public Schools Employee Salary Manual Amendment. This is typically an Biz Op 4, excuse me. Biz Op 4 is typically an annual event as we review the legislative changes, and Alexis Schaus is going to review them with us. She's not going to review all the legislative changes. Those are being made by law. There are a few changes where the board has, if you will, some greater potential discretion, and I think she's going to highlight those relatively minimal portions of that as we go through.
Thank you, sir. This is Alexis Schaus again. So this is the Public School Salary Manual, and you will see in your materials the first 2 pages are not officially part of the policy, but they do outline the series of changes that we've made for this as a baseline for this coming year. As Ted Duncan stated, there is most of these changes do reflect explicit modifications to legislation, and also provide a kind of summary of what the impact has been on public school employees for pay increases or not pay increases. I'm going to highlight a couple of items that are not explicit in the legislation. We have added an item related to the principal salary and determining the EBOS growth to be how it is to be determined when a principal has had a break in service. The law states that it will be the 3 years of growth, and when there is a break in service, then the EBOS score of the most recent years, going back to 2014, which is when the growth scores started in their current state. So that item is added. There is also an addition to state that for a principal allotment for a new school, that it is within funds available. And this addition has become necessary due to the late number of new schools that were requested by school districts this year that we were not able to get into the budget. Specifically, these are virtual schools that were requested at the end of last fiscal year. And then in probably the biggest change was in Section F, where we have added absence codes to reflect the coronavirus additions. So for the contagious disease policy in the benefits manual that you're probably aware of at this point, it is the policy 9.4.2. There is a new absence code to track that absence of absence code number 24, and then we have also added 3 absence codes to track the federal absences related to the coronavirus benefits that were provided by the federal government. Those are the major changes that, as I stated, are not either technical in nature or explicit in legislation.
All right, so thank you for that. It's very helpful for you to pull, for you having pulled those out so that we can just focus on those, understanding there are a number of other changes that you have in your materials and have undoubtedly reviewed that are consistent with requirements set out by statute. Are there any questions about any of these items that represent changes or modifications which exercise some sense of judgment and not absolutely strict statutory language, if you will, on these relatively few items?
Mr. Duncan,
Yes, Dr. Oxford.
Vice Chair Duncan, thank you very much. I have need a little bit of clarification around the piece about principal allotments based on virtual, the addition of virtual schools in school districts. Ms. Schaus, if you could, I missed some of it. Actually, I was breaking up. If you could clarify that, I would appreciate it.
Certainly. So normally if there is a new school that is established in the school year, we receive notice of that so that we can include that a 12-month principal allocation in the budget for those new schools. At the end of last school year, in response presumably with COVID, we received a significant number, I would say probably 10 requests from school districts to open new schools, and this was in June, once we had already established the budget for the coming year. As a result, the allocations, the budget for those principal allotments were not included, and so we do not have the funds available to provide principals for all those new schools that were established at the end of the year.
All right, thank you very much. That helps a lot. The whole issue of the addition of charter schools and the employment of new principals is fascinating. That, that opens up other discussions around the principalship, but thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan.
Thank you. And to be clear, these are not charter schools. These are new virtual academies that are
All
part
right,
of the.
I'm aware of
Yes,
that, right?
Yes, okay. Wanted to make sure there's no misunderstanding. But the timing of them, that most of them were created over the course of the summer, which was well after the timing for the budget allotments had gone in. Any other questions on these items? All right, not seeing anything. I'm aware I skipped Biz Op 3, but Ms. Schaus has Biz Op 5 and 6, so why don't we let her continue on her roll, and I'll come back to Biz Op 3. I apologize for inadvertently skipping that. Biz Op 5 is the allotment policy for amendments and additions related to session law. This is similar to the salary manual allotments revisions. There are a very limited number that are not pretty clearly specified by statute, and Ms. Schaus, if you could guide us through that, it'd be much appreciated.
Yes, sir. And similar to the changes to the salary manual, there is provided a document that is separate from the allotment policy changes called the summary of changes. And so this does provide kind of a bare bones kind of synopsis of the changes that have been made. As stated, the majority of these changes do reflect the session law that was passed in the recent legislative sessions. However, there are some items that I'm going to highlight that are not strictly legislative or technical in nature. For the at-risk, well, you can see there that we have made some additions and deletions to our definition of terms. These are to add items that were not there previously, or to update the definitions specifically for child with disabilities that were outdated. Moving down to the at-risk allotment, which is PRC 069, this was changed to include a statement in there. Currently, as part of that allocation, school districts receive a dollar amount to provide a school resource officer for each high school in their school district. arguably not sufficient funding for a full school resource officer, but it is part of that formula. We have added language to exclude virtual high schools as receiving funding for a school resource officer as part of that formula. In PRC, for the charter schools allocation, under PRC 036, we add language to specify the allotment installment for different statuses of charter schools. This actually has been procedure for a number of years, but we did add that explicitly in that allotment policy to state that school districts receive a third, charter schools receive a third of their allocation at the beginning of the year, and then if they are in good financial standing, will receive access to 100% of their allocation after the month one, or if they are in financial non-compliance disciplinary status, then their allocations are distributed on a monthly basis. And that is consistent with the state board policy on charter schools being in non-compliance. The next item I'd like to draw your attention to is PRC 078, which is a digital learning initiative. This policy has been modified by the digital learning division. It modifies the formula to provide funding based on requested licenses at a unit cost. It also requires the public school units, if they receive an allocation, that they are required to expend those funds by November 30th. And if they do not, then those funds shall revert and be used at the statewide, for the statewide initiatives. They had experienced in the past that school districts had requested funding and then had not used those funds, and then they were not able to be used for other purposes. With that, I believe those are the major changes that have been incorporated that are not legislative or technical in nature.
All right, thank you for that review. Are there any questions or comments on any of those items? That is the summary that's been put together by Ms. Schaus on the non-legislatively directed items. All right, not hearing any, let's go on then to Biz Op 6, which is the annual report to the Joint Legislative Education Oversight Committee on start and end dates, which obviously this year's been complicated by the events of the pandemic.
Yes, this is Alexis again. So this report is usually required back in, actually the school districts were required to report back in April. This is the second year of this required report, and it's legislated. We had requested for an extension due to the COVID situation, and so we'll be submitting this report by the middle of this month. This report provides the first instructional day by school and the established and last instructional day as it is in their initial calendar. And if they have a start date that is earlier than August 17th, then the school district is required to provide the legislated citation as that authorizes them to start earlier than August 17th. Normally we would have school districts that are starting earlier because of calendar waivers due to inclement weather. That is not applicable this year, and so we actually have very few schools that are starting earlier. Most of those schools are the cooperative innovative high schools, the early colleges.
Thank you. Are there any questions on this report this year? I know in other years we've had questions, a couple of questions along the way, but I think this year is a different year. All right, not hearing any. Alexis Schaus, thank you very much for all the review of those items. We'll go back to Biz Op 3 at this point. Biz Op 3 is the COVID-19 Recovery Act Ellis funds for proposed recipients of these funds. Dr. Tricia Townsend will lead us through this item in terms of the process of how the timing of the applications, when the applications were received and reviewed, the fidelity of the process that was used, that is, that there was a uniform standard used, and then talk a little bit about the grants that have been made. Dr. Townsend.
Hey, thank you, Vice Chair Duncan.
You are welcome.
Okay, joining me today are Tina Letchworth, Section Chief, and Ellis State Coordinator Jennifer Smith. We are here today to present you the recommendations for the Ellis Grant Program. The purpose of the Ellis Grant is to fund high-quality, independently validated, extended learning and integrated student support service programs for at-risk students whose learning opportunities have been negatively affected by COVID-19. The funding for this particular grant source comes from House Bill 1043, otherwise known as the 2020 COVID-19 Recovery Act. And last month, we came before the board to present the allotment policy. Ellis is actually for nonprofit partners. They partner with local LEAs, they partner with local school administrative units to actually provide supports to students. And so there are 3 criteria for service within this particular grant program. At-risk students who are not performing at grade level, students who are at risk of dropping out, and then students who are at risk due to suspension or expulsion. So I'll need to explain a little bit about the competition grant timeline. And so this particular program was actually first in the mix last fall. And so we initially put out a request for proposals in August. We did a series of technical assistance webinars, and applications were actually due in October. However, this particular funding was tied to the state budget but did not pass. And as a result, these particular applications just sat on the shelf. It was rejuvenated in May when the COVID-19 Recovery Act passed, and it actually changed the format or the requirements of the grant a little bit. And so instead of just providing supports to students either during the school day or after school, there was the added issue of trying to make sure that we were supporting students as a result of COVID-19. So what we did was we went back to those same applications and we created an addendum for participants. And so that was actually done in June. And so it was pretty fast moving after that. So we did the technical assistance webinar in June. Those addendums were due just a few weeks later. And then we were able to complete those reviews in June, and then now we are before you to actually seek your permission to grant these funds. And so just a little bit of information for you. We initially received 47 applications in October for the original Ellis grant. And so what we did was reach out to them and let them know that funding was now available, but there would be some slight tweaks. And so at that point, we had 9 organizations to say that they would no longer be interested in the program. Some of them were not interested because the time frame to spend the funds was too short. Some didn't, were not able to deal with the fact that they would not have staffing to really adequately support students during COVID-19, and some just did not want to open their programs in a pandemic. And so still whittling ourselves down from that 47, 7 organizations never uploaded anything, 2 were deemed not in good standing. Then that from that point, there were 29 that were remaining, and then 2 organizations failed to check assurances, and that brings us down to the total that we present to you today of 27. So a little bit about the review process. Level 1 review was internal to the Federal Program Monitoring and Support Division, and we had external partners from the SERV team. Those reviewers went through a technical checklist and quality review rubric. Okay, and each addendum received 4 independent reviews or scores. We then moved into level 2 reviews. The review team met on June 25th to reach a consensus score and finalize scores of the submitted addendums. And now we're at level 3 review, where we seek permission from the state board. Okay. Our scoring process actually led us to, I guess, 3 basic levels that the recipients could receive. And so let me explain a little bit. Level 1, level 2, and level 3. And so those particular applications, if there were some questions or some challenges within their applications, they were able to receive a grant that was up to 40% of their initial funding request. And so let me explain that a little bit. Initially, the Ellis program actually allowed for a maximum of $500,000 for applicants. However, we've tried to take a scaled approach because that would have been for 1 full year of programming. This particular grant will only be from July 1 up until December 30th. And so they wouldn't have the full amount of time. And so we've gone ahead and scaled that back. So if you received a level 1 score, then you would get 40% of your initial request. Level 2, you had a sufficient application and you would need limited technical assistance. We were able to scale that to 45% of the initial request. And then if you had a strong application or level 3, we were able to allocate 50% of your initial funding request. And then we factored in a series of priority considerations. And so we looked at, we actually awarded various points. And so you could receive 1 point for serving schools that are considered to be low performing. You could receive 1 or 2 points if you were in a county that was considered economically distressed. So tier 1 counties were able to receive 2 points. Tier 2 counties received 1, and tier 3, of course, received none. And then the last priority in that, if you were able to have matching funds from either Title I or Title IV, that would have netted you with an additional point. And so based on these priority points, we were able to add a small bump to those awards. And so 4 priority points would net you an additional $47,000, 3, $45,000, 2, $43,000, and 1, $40,000. And so now I will read the list of applicants: Book Harvest, East Durham Children's Initiative, Jehovah Rapha International, Piedmont Conservation Council,
So,
RAM
so
organization.
you know, we have that in front of us. It's up on our board, so you don't actually have to read them all. We're able to do that, just to make it a little easier for you.
All right, well, we'll continue to skip through that.
Yeah.
Okay, and then now that brings us to the distribution of applications. And I will note that the line for Northwest should read 0, 0 number of grants. And so the regional distribution, 1 for Northeast, 7 for North Central, 5 for Southeast, 2 for Sand Hills, 3 for Piedmont, 8 for Southwest, and 1 for Western. Bring us to 27 total grants for a total of $4.7 million. Okay.
So, thank you very much for that presentation. I want to make a couple of comments on this if I could, and then open for questions and comments. As everyone could see, the timeline on this was very short. And I think the department made the best judgment that was available to them to already go off of existing applications and then check on COVID-19 effect on the propriety of the grant being awarded in that way. I also think the department did an excellent job putting forth a process and acting under it with fidelity, which is what is so important to the integrity of any grant process. So I thank the department on the good work that they did. I feel like it would be inappropriate to skip over this moment and not have us at least stop and think about the issue of grants. This one came to us in a way that it would have to be done by grants. But one can only look at the distribution of the grants at the end to feel inequity in the air. North Central got 7 of the grants, Southeast got 5, Southwest got 8, Piedmont got 3. That's 23 of the 27 grants for $3.935 million out of the total of $4.78 million. The other sections of the state, Northwest, Northeast, Western, and Sand Hills got a total of 4 grants for $845,000. We all know, by way of example, that as we look at the COVID-19 impact, the Northeast area of our state is very heavily impacted by including broadband issues that also exist in the western part of the state is another area that's very hard hit. And so I think grants can be a very good thing, and there's a lot of areas where they can be a very good thing. But sometimes the ability of organizations to react well to a grant, have the ability to write grants well, just have a greater sense of experience and aptitude, if you will, on grants can be necessarily influential all the way down to being aware of the grants and actually applying for them. And so when we look at this and we know that the needs are severe across our state right now, this is one where it needed to be done this way. It was statutorily prescribed. So I'm using it only as an example, not as that there's anything wrong with what's done here. This needs to be approved so these organizations can go about wisely using these resources to help our families and kids. But I would like us to think longer term about grants as a way, to the extent we have input on it, would like us to think about grants as a way, is that the most effective way to distribute funding to all the places where we know there are significant needs? I raise that genuinely as a philosophical / policy kind of consideration that this particular one just helps to point out. And people may have different thoughts about that, and I welcome them, but I thought it'd be appropriate to raise. So with that, any comments or questions about either this grant specific or the philosophical / policy question that I'm asking and looking for help on? Okay. All right. So what I'm sensing is that people want to think about that, and we maybe talk about that another time. And it is late in our meeting, so that's the way we'll go ahead and proceed. But I do commend that to your thought process in any event. That's the end of our action on first read items. Biz Op 1 through 6 all fall in that category. Biz Op 7 is an action item coming off our discussion from last month, and it's the new policy with respect to superintendent's communications and reporting obligations. We've gotten no comment back on that document at this point, so are there any questions or comments now? Not hearing any. Update on contracts, we've got executed contracts reports and planned contract reports. I have not heard any questions this month. Most months I hear a question about one. I know we talked through a couple on during the committee meeting, which was very helpful discussion. Have not heard any questions from anyone separately, so I assume unless you have one now, we don't have questions this month on these items. All right, next up is the agency vacancy report. I want to thank Ron Paxton for his good work. That report is up on the board right now. Again, I have not heard questions about it, but I want to commend Ron Paxton and his department. We have asked for various modifications of this report at different times to add information and or characterize the information in a different way or different approach. And the Human Resources Department has been responsive to that and has updated the approaches and the information in the way it's provided to us. I think at this point, all the various requests for presentation of the information have been met. If there are others, we certainly want to get that from the board and be in a position to be responsive, but I do want to say thank you for the responsiveness to date in getting the information put together in a presentation manner that's helpful to the board. Are there questions or comments on this month's agency vacancy report? All right, not hearing any. That brings us to the monthly budget report. This monthly budget report, as I understand it, does not quite reflect the year end. As you know, our fiscal year would end at June 30th. It does not quite reflect our year-end report. That was still during the month of July. There's a number of adjustments and modifications that are being made. So I think this is, and if I'm not saying this right, someone I know, Catherine Johnson, will correct me quickly and correctly. I think this is not what we should deem as our year-end, fiscal year-end report yet, but this is a work in process as it's being going through the process of being finalized, which I think is happening at or about now. We have not spent much time on this monthly budget report yet, and whatever changes we might want to work on that. Today is not the day to do that, and that's been true for a while because we've been so pressed with coronavirus emergencies that have been rightfully taking the front seat. But at some point, I think it's important that we spend some more time on this document and what modifications will be helpful. Some of which are already in the works based on the board's policy, but we may want to have some further thought and modification about how we can make this truly a useful document that helps guide the board's priorities as we go forward. Unless there's additional questions or comments on that, that would conclude the BizOp Committee's report for today, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan, and to all the team that has worked on these many BizOp items that are so critical to supporting our students and teachers. We now come to a couple of items of new business that I'd like to share. First, among the many things that COVID-19 has revealed is the tenuous financial position that many of our districts face. It's important in these uncertain times that we ensure adequate funding for our public schools. And this has been an issue that we've heard about, particularly from our superintendents. This time I'd like to call on Superintendent Jackson to comment on this situation. Superintendent Jackson.
Good afternoon, thank you. Good afternoon, thank you. I would just very quickly say that this is probably the issue that is preeminent for most of our superintendents right now, trying to build new systems and understand the impact of what we will be faced with as we try to build new systems in an old structure, meaning that we're still going to count kids the same way we always have, and our resources are still have to come to us in those ways. I would say that we're facing unprecedented uncertainty. And as we do that, I think we're going to have to recognize that we may have to build new systems to support those things that we're encouraging districts to do. Just standing up remote learning and providing opportunities for parents to have choice within those models creates the opportunity for some parents to not come back until they're comfortable. We're going to give them that choice. And I think we're going to have to be very flexible in our abilities to certify and verify those things that will drive the resources to our schools. I think that if we're not careful, we're going to exacerbate the equity issue that we so pointedly discuss, and understanding that at some point we're all going to come back face to face. And my concern is that I'm not going to have the resources at my disposal to meet the social and emotional needs of my students and my staff when that happens. And so I would just ask for us to be very flexible and find some level of balance between fiscal prudence and operational grace as we talk about putting the systems back together. We're going to have to build them back on the ground. And some of our communities are already going to deal with an exacerbated economic situation locally in the local economies. And I think if we're not careful, we're going to heap on with some level of reduction of resources at the school level. I challenge you, as I've challenged my staff, to just be open to the fact that it's not prudent to pour new wine into an old wineskin. If we're going to build new systems, then we have to build new systems to support those new systems. And so I would ask that we be extremely flexible in how we approach allowing districts to maintain the resources that they have so that they can meet the needs of the students who will be returning at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Jackson. That highlights the fact that as a board, we've up to now adjusted relevant policies to allow schools to provide at least the same level of programming support before the virus forced the closure of our school buildings. And on this particular item, our staff has researched our policies and consulted with legislative staff. And so that brings us to this point. It's more important now for us to continue to collaborate with our partners in the General Assembly to work on updating our systems, particularly this one around ADM, to maintain similar funding options in the 2020-21 school year. And so while it's apparent that the board can provide a temporary solution based on input from legislative staff, only the General Assembly can adjust the appropriate statutes, including the 2007 session law concerning ADM funding and preventing it from decreasing for our districts this year. So with that fact, I seek this board's support to call on the General Assembly to pass legislation to mitigate the effects of ADM funding decreases for our districts in the 2020-21 school year. And this would include seeking authority to pursue changes to and legislatively mandated reductions in initial allotments, again, to mitigate the impact of the unpredictable effects of the COVID pandemic on student enrollments for the 2020-2021 school year. The specific language in such legislation we would charge Mr. McKinney and Mr. Zyko with working on in partnership with our legislative partners. So let me pause now for any discussion, comments, questions on this proposal.
Mr. Chair, this is Bristow Smith.
Yes, is this Mr. Ford? Excuse me, Mr. Bristow Smith. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Not to confuse me with the great James Ford. That would be quite an honor if I would ever confuse Tim. But, Mr. Chair, I just want you to know that you have the full support of every principal and every administrator and that I know when we consider working with our legislative partners to create legislation that will perhaps hold our LEAs harmless for in terms of ADM funding. We have a number of systems that are linked to the enrollment that are in our schools. One of those is actually principal compensation, and we've heard from a number of principals across the state who are concerned that their ability to provide for their families and the incomes that they've come to depend upon, which are linked to enrollment, are going to be potentially and unintentionally, but potentially impacted as a result of the wild swing in ADM in their districts. So on behalf of the principals in the state, and one in particular in Onslow County reached out to us this week, I wanted to just say how grateful we are that the board is leading on this, and we do call upon the legislature to meet us on this halfway. The ability that we have to serve young people, particularly in areas that are marginalized or under-resourced, as Dr. Jackson is alluding to, are directly linked to this outdated funding model. And so you earlier in the meeting today alluded to the fact that the additional funds that we've received for COVID don't even come close to meeting the overwhelming needs that we have. And so I do think it's very important that we are leading on this ADM issue, and I'm grateful that the legislature is potentially going to be willing to hear us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bristow-Smith. Other comments on this proposal from my colleagues? Hearing none, proposing that we will include this in our roll call items to vote on at the conclusion of this meeting. The last new
Mr. Chair?
business. Yes, sir. Is it?
Oh, this is Dan Forrest. I'm sorry, I was muted. I was trying to talk there, but couldn't hear me.
Yes, Lieutenant Governor.
Just a quick question on that last item, just because I'm having a little bit trouble hearing on the line here. Was that last conversation a resolution, or is that something we're voting on? I'm not clear.
Yes, we would include this as an action item to vote on at the conclusion of the meeting, and we do so recognizing the financial situation that our state is in. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Our final new business item concerns a challenge that we all face, but particularly that our students and teachers face each day. And that is the ability for our students and teachers to connect during this time when so many of our students, as the superintendent included in his report, are not going to be in our buildings this year. And while much has been accomplished since last March to close these gaps, much remains to be done. At the same time, there are far too many North Carolinians, especially recent college graduates, who are in effect on the sidelines, not of their own choosing, but due to COVID's impact on our economy. These talented, motivated, and spirited North Carolinians have so much to offer to our students. And so we're calling on them and others like them to join the cause of educating our children. As a result, today we're announcing the formation of a North Carolina Education Corps, a highly motivated, talented, and dedicated team of volunteers who want to serve and give back to our great state. These Corps members will go to every district in our state, augment the heroic work of our teachers, and be the caring tutors, mentors, and coaches that our students so desperately need. We're currently working with the Governor's Office for Volunteering and Service, along with a growing list of partners that include Communities in Schools, Teach for America, College Advising Corps, the Institute for Emerging Issues, and many other partners. In addition to more fully leveraging our talented recent college graduates, the North Carolina Education Corps will enable many more of our students, each year to meet our state's secondary attainment goal of 2 million by the year 2030, as led by our partner, My Future NC. And so if you would like to contribute to this most worthy cause, or volunteer to serve as a mentor, tutor, coach for one of our terrific students, please contact me or any member of our team. We'll soon have a more formal announcement on this exciting opportunity and how you can join this most worthy cause. So that concludes our new business items. Board members will now vote on any item requiring action from your committee reports. A thorough discussion and report was provided on each item, including any respective consent items. Remember that any item on the consent agenda is primarily not complex and may have come to the board for discussion in a prior month. And I note also that board members have seen these consent items for about a week. I also note for the record that Mr. Buxton is recused from EICS 4. At this time, I ask if there's a request to remove any item from the consent, action, or action on first reading agendas. Hearing none, I request a motion to approve the following: the July 8 and 9, 2020 meeting minutes, EICS 1 and 2, and 6 through 8, SLA 1 through 3 and 7, BizOp 1 through 7, and the COVID-19 average daily membership request to the General Assembly that we just discussed. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, Wendell Hall, I make a motion.
Motion by Mr. Hall. Is there a second?
Second?
Second by Mr. Buxton. Any discussion on this motion? Hearing none, Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers? Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you to all staff and presenters for this August 6, 2020 meeting. Colleagues, this concludes our committee work and meeting for the day. While there will be many unknowns during the 2020-2021 school year, continued focus to address our equity and whole child priorities will ensure that we meet the needs of our students as we return to school. And also, all of our educators, classified or non-classified, are critical to the success of our students. We'll continue to advocate for health and safety for everyone as we seek the goal of all students in school. We end by thanking leaders in our state for leading the way and providing the courage and support needed to make this year successful in spite of the challenges we face and turn them into opportunities. We'll continue to lead and walk with you through the uncertainty by listening and continuing to be your partner. I now ask for a motion to adjourn this August 6, 2020 meeting.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Keenan. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. White. Dr. Townsend Smith?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
You can keep talking.
Mr. Chastain? Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you for the great work. Be safe. This meeting's adjourned.
And all.